Next assembly we're going to discuss is the Febco Model 745, which is a pressure vacuum breaker assembly produced by Febco from about 1980 to 1997. Although it was a long range of years, very few of these were produced. It's a pressure vacuum breaker made out of a glass fiber reinforced nylon. Most pressure vacuum breakers have a bronze body, but this one had the glass fiber reinforced nylon. The check mechanism is very similar to what we see in the 765, which we'll see in a minute. Pop-it assembly a little bit different. Model 745 pressure vacuum breaker. Let's take it apart and see what it looks like.
I've got one here I want to show you though, because it does look a little different. What's different about it basically is it has a glass fiber reinforced nylon body as opposed to a bronze body that we're used to seeing in small pressure vacuum breakers. Canopy came off. There was a clamp that held the bonnet assembly on it. Came off like this. Bonnet, pop-it, check assembly, spring, and check and disc holder for the check. So unusual because of the body, plastic construction, glass fiber reinforced nylon actually. No more parts available. This is the Febco Model 745.
Next assembly we're going to look at is the Febco Model 760, which is a pressure vacuum breaker that was produced from about 1950 to about 1975. It was one of the original designs of the pressure vacuum breaker, produced again back in the late 40s, early 50s when it finally went into production. The 760 was unique. Piping came in from the bottom and piping came back out down this way in an up and down piping configuration. But to rebuild the unit, you had to break the bolts across the body, and the body had to be separated. That meant there had to be a union on the downside of the number 2 shutoff on this particular unit. So it was not inline repairable and had to be taken out of the apart to get the parts inside the assembly. Rubber parts are no longer available, and it's kind of a footnote valve, but that's the Model 760. Let's take a look at one.
I've got one here. I want to show it to you real quick. Model 760, this being a 1-inch version. When you took it apart, top came off, and you can see where the piping had to have a union, so you could take it apart to rebuild it. The spring check seat was cast in the body. What was rather unique was that we had the check disc, but on the back of the check disc we had the disc holder. The diaphragm had a small sealing area right there, and the check mechanism actually consisted of the disc and the back of the diaphragm for sealing on the check mechanism. Air inlet on the top like this. That's what the 760 looked like. Here's a little footnote valve. It was called the Model 45. Looks very similar to the 760, but it was actually Febco's first introduction trying to come up with, well, not second introduction I should say, of a double check. And back in the old days, a lot of people saw this design as the pressure vacuum breaker, and then they see this and couldn't understand it because it didn't have an air inlet discharge on the back. It also had 4 test cocks, which I'm going to say on a PVB you didn't have. Very rare valve, was not really regular production because they went to the 792 model on their double check assembly. But anyway, this is the Febco Model 760 pressure vacuum breaker.
The next assembly we're going to discuss is the Febco Model 765. 765 is a pressure vacuum breaker produced in sizes 1/2 through 2 inch. Production began in 1975 and is still in production today. The body itself is a bronze construction unit, and inlet outlet shutoff, 2 test cocks, and the canopy on the top. The assembly can be broken down into 2 basic designs: the 1/2 through 1.25 inch design, which had one basic construction design, and the 1.5 through 2 inch, which had a second type of construction design. So let's go ahead and take a look at the 765, and let's look at both versions, the small 1/2 through 1.25 inch and the larger 1.5 through 2 inch.
So let's talk about the small, meaning 1/2 through 1.25 size first. I have an example of it here, a cutaway version. And first thing that's going to happen to disassemble, there's going to be a canopy nut on the top. And I show the canopy because a lot of times, unfortunately, they're missing. This is a very important part of this valve. Unfortunately, the canopy gets used holding keys, chains in trucks, things like that. But it's very necessary to the assembly because it's not just a splash guard like some people assume when you turn it back on, but it also keeps things from falling inside the body itself. Notice that the color of the plastic is a kind of a translucent color. This particular plastic is a nylon type plastic and does have some issues with UV deterioration. That's another reason that the canopy has to be on top of it to make sure it doesn't deteriorate from the sun. If you read on the imprint right here, you'll see that it says hand tighten only. So if we see that verbiage, hand tighten only, that tells us that we know there's going to be an O-ring inside. So it should only be hand tight. As I've said many times before though, most of the time we can't be sure what somebody did before us and may have over-tightened that down. Again, with the hand tighten, we know there's going to be an O-ring underneath. What we have to do is unscrew the bonnet to get this apart. Now, if you can't get it apart by hand, I've seen people take wrenches here, grabbing it that way. You're going to break this off if you try to grab it by this. The stress on these legs is not intended to hold the bonnet. If you have to disassemble the bonnet, get yourself a large pipe wrench and or channel locks and grab it by the outside diameter of the bonnet above the brass. You don't want to hit the brass port because it can cause a problem. So we want to go ahead and remove the bonnet by unthreading it. It should be hand tight, but if it's not, again, a wrench on the outside diameter only is what you want to do. So, removal of the bonnet, O-ring seal underneath. Now, there will be two types of bodies at this point. If you look up close right here, you'll see this little indent right in here. That indent is where the O-ring on the bonnet sits. Some of the very older versions in the early few years, like, first 10, 15 years of production, something like that, there wouldn't be an O-ring slot in the body. There would be a small little chamfered area. And there were actually two different O-rings that were utilized on this bonnet. The most common one is the large O-ring, which is in production today and has been for the last 20 plus years. But if you see the old version, this slot that you see here is not there, and it's a very small little chamfer. That bonnet will have a very small O-ring on it. You'll have to use that small O-ring on that particular body. There were actually two little white plastic washers that went on the top of it to go ahead and seal into that body. But the majority in the 90 percentile will be like this, where you have the recess right there for the larger O-ring. Once I have the bonnet off, poppet comes out next. The poppet disc just stretches out of the poppet disc holder to remove it and replace it. Check assembly has this piece across here called a spring retainer, which is very important to the working of this. And you see our disc holder here. So to disassemble the spring, what we have to do is push down on opposite sides of the spring retainer. Rotate it 90 degrees, which allows us to flip up one side and pull the spring retainer out from the top. There you can see the four little clips on the spring retainer. Check spring comes out next with the check disc holder. Check seats are cast into the body and not replaceable. One screw holds the disc into the disc holder. So these are the parts of our 765. Now, air inlet on the spring loading of the bonnet is set at the factory. So there's no way of changing that air inlet loading by tightening another screw on some of the other models, which we'll see in just a few moments. So this bonnet in one piece comes out and is replaced in one piece if necessary. They make a rubber repair kit which has the check disc, poppet disc, and cover O-ring, or they make a replacement kit which has all internal parts that you see right here. Reassembly is going to be just the reverse. It's a good idea when you have this cone-shaped type spring and you're trying to insert into a body. Take that outer coil, just give it a little bit of tension there against the disc holder. It'll hold it like that, making it easier to get into the body. Now for the part that's very important is the spring retainer. A lot of people say that the check assemblies have problems with this. Well, it has to do with this spring retainer. If the spring retainer is not set in correctly, you will have low loads on the check assembly, causing it to be repaired a lot more often than necessary. This is a case where a lot of times a misrepair causes a future repair because it wasn't fixed properly. So the spring retainer has to go in from the top, pushing down. Once you have it pushed down the spring, you rotate it 90 degrees. Now comes the important part. We're going to see up close here. See these four little clips right on the edge? Right here. And right over here. Again, and it has to be perfectly flat across the top. You can see the little clips right there also. So it's very important. The way that spring retainer is put in has a lot to do with the working of this check assembly. If that spring retainer is not completely, or the four clips are hanging up underneath that lip and perfectly flat across there, or it's slightly tipped like this, you will get improper spring loadings on the check assembly, causing it to not work. A lot of times people accuse it of being a bad valve because I can never get the check working, and most of the time it's just not having these four clips that you see right here. One there, two there, three there, and the fourth one back there. Those clips have to be mounted under that lip, perfectly square, critical for the working of this particular check assembly. Bonnet, poppet, back into the... Again, O-ring seal, so it only needs to be hand tight. Over tightening it just makes more work for you next time when you have to go taking it apart. And that's our 1/2 through 1.25" design of the 765. Here's what the 1.5 through 2 inch looks like. Obviously without the shutoff valves. We have our two test cocks here. That same canopy as we saw on the smaller version. Take the canopy off, first thing we're going to notice the differences between the 1.5" and 2" and the 1/2 through 1.25" is that the bonnet on the larger sizes is a bronze body like the rest of the check body, as opposed to the nylon as we saw in the small 1/2 through 1.25" size. The canopy, as we said earlier, size is important because it has the ability to keep stuff from falling in, and also not just a splash guard. But up until about 2004, approximately, the serial number and the model number were cast or were scratched into the canopy. So you can see right here where it says FEBCO and over here where it says model 765, and there was the serial number right down here. The trouble with that designation right there was that as the canopy was missing, so was all the important information on that particular model. So if you had the older version and the serial number was mounted here and the canopy was missing, suddenly you had no way of identifying this assembly as a model and or serial number. In 2004-ish, around that time, they went ahead and put the model number in the body and they put serial number cast in the body so that the serial number would travel with the body, not with the canopy. So older versions, canopy may have the serial number, the newer versions will be on the body itself. A couple observations you want to make once you've during the test procedure of this particular assembly. The first thing you want to notice is this little bolt sticking up the top here. You hopefully are going to see about 7 or 8 threads picking up the top, kind of like this. In other words, there should be enough threads so that with the canopy on there and the nut can tighten all the way down on there. The reason that's important, I'll show you in just a minute when we get it apart. The next thing I want to observe is that the poppet assembly has fallen down. My finger is about that far down. The reason I want to check that it fell down at least that 1.5 inches or so, because sometimes you might take it apart and it might be on the very tip up here of the rim. Hopefully if you did your test procedure properly, you would have made sure that it fell all the way down, but unfortunately even after you did the test, it may not fall all the way down and may be stuck towards the top, and I'll show you why in just a second. Next step we have to do is remove the bonnet. How we're going to do that is there are 6 bolts around the outside. There's an O-ring seal underneath, so go ahead and remove your bolts. Canopy will come off in one piece. Then we have our air inlet poppet. And the next thing we're going to see is this little 3-fingered spring retainer, our check spring, our check disc holder, and one screw holds the disc into the disc holder. Seat is cast in the body and is not replaceable. Now, inside the body, you're going to notice one important thing right here is this little notch, and it's important when we go to put this back together. So pay attention where this notch is, because that's going to make a big difference on how we put it back together. First thing we're going to do is replace our check disc, take our spring, and like on the smaller version, just have a little tension on the spring inside the disc holder like this. Now this is the currently produced one, and it's been this way for about 15-20 years, but in the olden days, and again the olden days are important because a lot of times the olden days are what we run across when we repair, the disc holder was a brass disc holder that looked like this. And instead of there being a guide on the bottom and on the top, the only guide was on the bottom portion. And the way you can tell, like this one, is it was broken off. The old days they had the brass disc holder, what would happen is it would cock sideways, and the brass being stronger than this nut the bolt right here where the disc holder would hold the disc into the disc retainer, it would break off because it would cock sideways inside the body. So to stabilize it, they put a rear guide on the back side and put to a plastic check assembly so that if it cocked sideways, it wouldn't have the problem of wedging and breaking off as we saw here. The earlier version, the spring retainer, was also made out of bronze also. So they went to the plastic version like you see here, and this is, definitely at least 15 years ago now that they went to that design, back around about 95. Anyway, reassembling now, we've got our spring ready to go back into the body. Check disc holder. Now here's where I mentioned that little recess is important in the body, because you'll notice in this spring retainer there are 3 legs. 2 legs of one size and 1 leg that has a smaller size. See the 2 large ones and then the smaller one on the top here. They are different diameter, different widths for a reason, because if you go into the body, you'll notice that that thinner one fits right inside that recess. The large ones do not fit inside the recess. So that's the way that it's supposed to go, and that's why that small little leg is there, to put the small leg from the spring retainer. The reason that that's a problem is because that's where it belongs, but you'll notice I can also put it in wrong like this where nothing is in that retainer, and that's where we have a lot of problem where people putting this back together incorrectly cause it not to work. So let's do it the correct way. and see why that matters. So the correct way is that the spring retainer with the small arm has to be in that recess just like that. Now on top of this sits our poppet. The disc stretches out of the disc holder, new one pushed back in. Notice in our bonnet we have, in between the bolt holes, we have a little knob between each of the bolt holes. And that knob happens to be the same diameter as that small leg again. So once this is sitting inside the body like this is what it's supposed to sit like, with the legs on these knobs. Again, I can rotate it different locations, but this knob only fits in one location on the body. The reason it's important to be in that little recess, because if that spring retainer is, if that spring retainer is pushing on the knobs like it's supposed to be, like that, the poppet assembly will move up and down very easily. But if I turn it this way where it's not on the knobs, now suddenly the tension from the check spring is pushing up on the spring retainer, which is causing the air inlet to look like this. And that's why I wanted you to see, if it looked like it was just up a little bit, what's happening in this case is the check spring is actually closing the poppet against the air inlet, or it'll sit just a 1/4 inch off. If it's sitting properly, it should fall a good, like I showed you my finger indent, about that far, about 1.5 inches. If it's improperly installed, it'll only fall about that far, about a 1/4 inch. So the reassembly is real important on this particular design. You can assemble it incorrectly, and if you do, it's not going to work well. So let's go ahead and get it ready to go back together the right way. So the first thing we have to do is insert the spring retainer, having the leg here in the proper location. Poppet goes on top, O-ring around the side. Now we want to go ahead and put our bonnet on top, just like that. Now remember earlier I said pay attention to that nut on the top, that bolt coming through the top here, that it's above the nut enough to hold the canopy. Why is that important? Well, take a look at these two bonnets. Notice how tall it is on this one on your left and how much taller it is on the right. So on the right is the more correct location for that, and I'll show you why. This spring loading for the air inlet is set at the factory. Once it is set, it is locked down with this little lock nut right here. But notice what happens if I loosen that lock nut. This stem assembly threads right into the bonnet. And the more I thread it in, the more it's collapsing the air inlet spring. And if I screw it all the way in, notice what happens. I may not have any air inlet loading at all. So it's important that it be like this, not like this, because now I have an air inlet loading. So making sure that this is not all the way down is important. The trouble is it's set at the factory. You should not alter this in the field. But if for some reason you have no air inlet loading and you see that thread all the way up like that one, you know you're going to have a problem with the air inlet loading. You should have movement like this of that air inlet, not like this where there's no movement. Okay? So, if for any reason you do have to adjust that, make sure you open it enough that you do have an air inlet loading, and tell from your test procedure that you've got the right loading on that particular assembly. Reassembling, again back to that problem with that one leg, making sure it's sitting in the recess of the body. Bonnet on top. Line up our bolt holes. You want to keep pressure down on the bonnet until you get the bolt holes on bolts on opposite sides, because that spring tension is pushing up on the bonnet right now, and it can push up above there. So you want that type of a movement on that, and you want to see a good 8 threads or so on the top of that canopy. That's the 765, 1.5 through 2 inch. Next assembly we're going to discuss is the Febco model 766.
pressure vacuum breaker produced by Febco in sizes 1/2, 3/4, and 1 inch. Production began about 1998, discontinued in 2003. Relatively short produced, and not very many of the assemblies were sold over the years. And here's what the body looked like. Brass body, inlet outlet shutoffs, and the test cocks mounted to the ball valves. This is the model 766. Let's go ahead and take it apart and see what it looks like. First and most importantly, no more parts are available for this. It was built for a relatively short period of time, and they decided to go back to using the 765 as their standard model. But they did make this model 766 for a little while. First thing, notice that the test cocks are mounted on the shutoffs. No test cocks on the body. This appears in several different manufacturers' versions like this, and what's important about that is that if you ever did change the shutoffs and you did not put a tapped ball valve there, or you turned it where the test cock was on this side, turning the ball valve over, you may not have any way to test that particular assembly. So when they mounted the test cocks on the ball valve, it was critical that we put a tap ball valve and that the test cock be on the right side. Canopy came off the top by just squeezing it. In other words, we'd squeeze it halfway and it would come off of the canopy, like the canopy would come off like that, so there was no screw nuts holding it in place. The bonnet assembly would unscrew from the top. O-ring seal, as you see right there, with our air inlet spring. Our air inlet poppet, which utilized a small O-ring for the air inlet disc, like that. Check assembly was underneath that with our disc holder, spring, and the seat inside the check body was replaceable. Made for a very short period of time, no more parts available. That's the Febco model 766. The next assembly we're going to discuss is the Febco model 770, which was a 2-check pressure vacuum breaker in the sizes 2.5 through 8, and a 1-check pressure vacuum breaker in the sizes 1 through 2 inch. So as I say, in the smaller sizes, 1 through 2 inch, it had a single check with the vacuum breaker mounted on the end of a T. So inlet came in through here on the left, through the check assembly, air inlet here, and then down into the body. The larger 2.5 through 8 inch were a 2-check double check, 2 check valves bolted together. It wasn't actually a double check, it was just 2 independently check valves with the air inlet on the mount of the number 2 check. The check valve that was originally produced with the model 770 did not have a 1-pound check loading like a modern check valve today. So they were discontinued rather quickly way back when because of the check valve not having a positive load. They were just a swing check that was bolted together. The air inlet, which mounted on the downside of the number 2 check on the large one and on the downside of the number 1 check on the small one. Rubber parts are no longer available for this, but the model 770 was produced for a few years. Pressure vacuum breaker assembly. Check assemblies we'll discuss a little bit later with some other models, but I do want to show you what the air inlet head looked like. And this was the same air inlet head that was used on the sizes 1 inch through 8 inch. So you can see this on a 1 inch assembly with a 2 inch, they had a huge bushing on the bottom giving it that capacity. No more parts available on the air inlet heads, but this is what the model 770 air inlet head looked like mounted on the end of either a single check on the 1 through 2 inch or two checks on the double check on sizes 2.5 through 8. Check assemblies on 2.5 through 8 were not spring loaded. No more parts available. Model 770. Next assembly we're going to discuss is the Febco model 775. This was a 2-check pressure vacuum breaker produced from about 1975 to the late 80s, about 88-ish, and produced in sizes 3 through 10 inch. The repair parts are still available for this assembly, and it was produced when there was a desire to have large pressure vacuum breakers, meaning larger than 2 inch. And basically what it does, they took a double check and mounted an air inlet on the downside of this number 2 check. And this is what it looked like. On the 3 and 4 inch sizes, they utilized the double check assembly, the model 805, the bronze body with the flat tops. In the larger 6 through 10 inch sizes, they used the model 805 Y series, which was a cast iron body that was painted epoxy coated. On both designs, what they did is they simply placed an air inlet head on the downside of the number 2 check. The air inlet head is the same air inlet as appears in the model 765 pressure vacuum breaker. So basically just took the bonnet off the top, removed the check assembly out of the PVB for the air inlet portion of that. When you test it just like a vacuum breaker. Test the air inlet first, and then you test the check valves like a double check. So it's a 2-check PVB, no longer in production, but repair parts are still available.